So now that China has all these big island structures, and it already has some facilities and civilian and military personnel there, essentially U.S. will put naval blockade on that.
Well, let's define what a blockade is, because a lot of people say that it is an act of war already when you say there's a blockade. What's the clear definition of what a blockade is?
Well, essentially what U.S. will do will send probably aircraft carriers, advanced ships, probably even jet fighters, among others, and prevent the Chinese from resupplying their people there, and prevent the Chinese from sending new weaponries and other kind of advanced aggressive systems into the area. And of course, if the U.S. continues to put that blockade, at some point they have to vacate. Now, what is the legal basis for that? Because one big argument is that this is clearly going to be an act of war. It's too much escalation. Now, the fact of the matter is that in 1983, President Reagan himself, in an oceans policy statement, made it clear that while the United States does not ratify or did not ratify the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, which became a global convention by 1982, nonetheless the United States will respect the UNCLOS as a matter of customary international law. So even if we didn't sign it, there are many provisions of UNCLOS that are already part of customary international law, and we will respect that and will comply with that. Now, how is that relevant to us today? Philippines and China and United States. Well, the fact of the matter is that in that statement, President Reagan made it very clear. We will comply with UNCLOS even though we have not ratified it, because that needs Senate concurrence and he could not get it, provided the other party also respects the relevant provisions of international law.
In other words, China has to respect
and this
exactly
is the
what's
problem
happening.
now. Our arbitration case made it very clear that a lot of these artificial islands were made in a way that damaged the ecology of the area, in ways that violated international law, because these are contested land features, and while you're debating on their status, suddenly someone comes and builds fast on the ground. Those things are illegal. So a huge portion of what China is doing, at least from the interpretation of America, is not in consonance with international law. Not to mention, there's also this aspect of reciprocity. Because the United States allowed the Chinese to pass through Guam and Hawaii and Alaska, even within the 12 nautical miles of American islands over the past few years. But the Chinese, since 2001, with the Hainan crisis, and more recently in 2009, 2014, 15, have prevented the Americans to pass through the South China Sea. So the Americans are saying, we are respecting international law, even if we didn't ratify it, we just signed it on an executive basis. You ratified it, but you're not respecting international law, and you're not even acknowledging the Philippine arbitration case, which is final and binding per international law. So if you don't do that, then we, per international law, in fact, there's an Articles on State Responsibility based on International Laws Commission. So it's also part of customary international law that if one country is not complying by certain international law, you have the right to invoke countermeasures. So from the United States point of view, there is some level of legal justification for these countermeasures. But even if there is a legal justification, the question is, what is the strategic implications?
Correct.
And that's where things are a little bit tricky. Now, the thing is this, over the past few years, I've criticized the Obama administration. I felt they were too reticent. They were too sober when they had to be a little bit more aggressive, and China took advantage of that. Noticing that Obama administration will always put a limit on how far it is willing to go, the Chinese said, they called the American bluff and they moved forward. Now it seems suddenly you have an aggressive shift when the US could escalate it too far. So now you have this wild swing between, I would say, reticence and now belligerence. And this is where everyone is concerned, including us in the Philippines. Of course, we have a mutual defense treaty with the Americans. Now, the interpretation of that mutual defense treaty depends on both sides, and we see different interpretation of that. But the fact of the matter is that if there'll be a war between China and the United States, US can invoke the MDT to call upon regional allies, including the Philippines and Japan and Australia, among others, to help them. That is why the Duterte administration, which is in the middle of a rapprochement with China, right, and at the same time in the middle of tensions with the United States, has made it very clear that whatever Mr. Tillerson is saying, or whatever escalation we'll see in American foreign policy, if this is just about American national interests, we don't want to do anything about it. So first, Foreign Secretary Yasay said, these statements are reflective of America's calculation of its own national interests, while Malacanang also made a statement recently saying that we're going to have a wait-and-see approach because we don't even know what they're talking about in operational terms.
But is it smart to have that wait-and-see approach? Because obviously right now it's all just statements. right? Of course, what Tillerson saying, China is saying it's also just his personal opinion. But then when Trump gets elected, I mean, it might very well be just an echoing of what is meant to happen.
Right. I mean, the thing is this. Studies show that American presidents, by average, implement more than two-thirds of their campaign promises. And if one of your campaign promises is to make America great again and to be tough on China, I think it's almost inevitable, especially with the kind of advisor he has, people I see around him. It's quite inevitable that the United States will up the ante in the South China Sea. Now, this puts us in a bind because we're trying to improve relations with China while recalibrating our relations with the U.S. and make sure we're not too dependent and attached to them. So this presents a particular difficulty for the Duterte administration. So far, the position of the Duterte administration is this: if things go ugly, you slug it out on your own. Don't involve us into this issue.
But we're directly in that area. I mean,
well,
so
it depends.
It
depends because
right?
the fight could be in the paracels. The fight could be in parts that are beyond our exclusive economic zone. But nonetheless, if you look at the Mutual Defense Treaty, it says that if a third party engages with the war with one of the two parties, the other party should come to the rescue if this is within the Pacific Rim.
Okay.
So nonetheless, you're correct. If there will be a conflict there, whether it's within our EEZ or outside, we will be involved. That is why this is going to be a very difficult, tricky situation for us. Now, the best thing we can do is what the Japanese and Australians have been doing over the past few days, is to caution the Trump administration to also go slow. So, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, very interesting, he was here in the Philippines to tell Duterte to go slow on China in terms of improving relations. Most likely he'll go to Trump and say, go slow on China in terms of provoking the Chinese. So you have now middle powers of Australia and Japan trying to act as voices of moderation.
Correct.
Because this is too wild of a swing and it's a very dangerous situation. But personally, I would rather hear General Mattis, the incoming defense secretary, to talk about this issue. Because number one, Mr. Tillerson, it was an oil executive. Number two, he was more focused on Russia and Europe and all, and oil-rich countries. I'm not sure how much he's really familiar with the nitty-gritties of the South China Sea issue, and I'm not sure how much power he'll really have in terms of shaping American foreign policy. General Mattis will be in charge of the Pentagon behemoth. I think he'll have significant influence of what the U.S. will do. So I'd rather look at defense people clarifying what exactly they mean. But I think nonetheless, this is a prequel of a different kind of America. An America that is going to be more unilateral, is going to be more aggressive, and will not hesitate to take it to the Chinese if it's necessary. And that puts us in a very difficult position because for the last 6 years, we have been used to a very sober, very reticent, very calculating president. And Trump is anything but that. Let's just be honest about it.
But how's that? From statement to action, though, I mean, how do you see it? How long do we have a time to sort of have a wait-and-see attitude? Because action can happen soon.
Well, remember, Trump will be more or less in power by this weekend, by our time. And within 100 days, that's where the presidents project change, right? So you may expect significant changes. Nonetheless, I think what we can do as allies of the United States, we're still allies, is to caution them to go for more gray area escalation, not this black and white, risk it all out war. For instance, one of the things that the U.S. could do is to conduct the so-called freedom of navigation operations, which is to pass through their warships within the 12 nautical miles of those artificial islands, because per international law, those are not islands. Those are just rock or low tide elevations that cannot generate their own territorial sea. I think the U.S. should just do what Obama did, but on a more sustained level and with more gravitas and with more probably international coverage. So in short, continue what Obama did, but a little bit more aggressively. But to go all the way and impose a blockade, I think that's a step way too far. And that's going to be dangerous. So as much as we want China to be constrained, we don't want also a situation where China will be pushed to also engage in its dangerous countermeasures and suck everyone in, including the Philippines. I don't think that's the right way forward. So the Americans have to be recalibrated about their calibration so far. I think they're too aggressive in shifting their foreign policy. And I think this is the problem of Trump. During the campaign promise, he dismissed Obama as a feckless woods. He tried to dismiss Obama as a weakling, as someone who's not decisive. So now suddenly he has this burden of trying to prove that I'm different. And this is where things could get very dangerous. That is why for me, the ultimate voices of moderation, our key allies like Japan, Australia, maybe we can also pitch in, but ultimately I think goes down to the Pentagon, because it's the Pentagon and the generals who will draw the exact plans for Mr. Trump and will say that this is legal, this is illegal, this could lead to war, this will not necessarily lead to war. I think that's where, once there's going to be a real situation, Rome, I think Trump will go for a less aggressive approach, maybe not go as far as imposing a blockade, but nonetheless, I think it's not going to be the same like now.